Mhm. Um, the other thing I want to get into was more environmental issues. So did you talk about, at all about deforestation and that sort of thing?
Well, yes, very much so, because uh, obviously we've used lots of wood and there's been a lot of deforestation. It's one of the things that people think that most deforestation is because we want wood. That's not true, actually, because most deforestation occurred on the planet. Like in Britain, for instance, we only have about 10% tree cover. That's not wood, it's because we wanted the land which the trees were growing on so we could grow our own crops. And we have 10% tree cover is because we find the wood so useful. So we haven't stripped that final 10%. And if you have nice broadleaf woodland, what you find is that people tended to have cut it down, and in the eastern United States, of course, to grow crops. And it's when people, when industrialization started, that extensive deforestation for wood itself happened, and that tended to be, particularly in America, that tended to be the softwood, the conifers. So that's in the late 19th century. That's when the deforestation of the Great Lakes area occurred around Chicago, where you are,
Mm.
and that once that was cut down and stripped, they moved on to the south of America, around Florida, where longleaf pine was cut down, and then nowadays it's up in the Pacific Northwest where there's lots of deforestation. And since that's not enough, as society's moved on, then it's finally moved over to the Far East and the Amazon, where tropical rainforests are being cut down. For cutting their rainforest down, we've already cut our forest down, and it happens, and now we're wanting more wood, so we're going over to the tropics nowadays.
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm here in Minnesota, and where there's, of course, a lot of white pines, which is a great wood. Um,
Right.
so one thing that's kind of famous around here is this place called the Lost 40. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but it's this place where there's years
No.
ago there was like a surveying error, and they missed like 40 acres of trees. So there's a bunch of like old growth white pines that were never cut down.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, because uh, that's fascinating, because I've been to Michigan, where there's just 28 pine forests in Michigan left in the in the peninsula of Michigan. So it's good to know that there's more, but it's just a tiny remnant of what was there. Of course, the white pine was incredibly important. And pine was the tree that the British were so keen on harvesting, so that we could make masts for our ships back in the 18th century. In fact,
Mhm.
we were so horrible to the American colonists. We said these are our trees, keep off, and instituted a policy where American colonists weren't allowed to use those. That obviously they got rather annoyed and started using themselves, and it all culminated right at the 1772 with a big fight called the Pine Tree Riot, where some people came to fighting to some people in New Hampshire for cutting down white pine trees, and then they were set on by the colonists in what's known as the Pine Tree Riot, which became a prototype, gave an inspiration for people for next year to have the Boston Party, where people, of course, protesting against the British taxes. But it was these British
Hello?
white factors to the start of the Revolutionary War. And of course, because the British then cut off from the supply of arms, that meant that a lot of our ships didn't have masts during that war, and that's one reason why you're independent and why you're the country now, and Britain is just a little minnow player in the world stage.
Mm-hmm.
You got your independence back in the
Because of wood. Yep.
because
And
of wood, yeah.
yeah, so so the crown outlawed colonists from chopping down the trees so they could be used for the ships.
And the ship's masts.
Yeah,
Imagine this mast about 150 foot long, and imagine how difficult it's to cut a tree down with its mast intact. You can drag it down, float it down the river, sail it all the way across the Atlantic to Britain, where then we could build our ships. So it was an amazing undertaking. And you might say, well, why didn't British use their own masts? And the thing is that we never had any trees that were big enough in Britain. All our
mm-hmm.
trees were things like oak trees. We'd long since harvested them. We'd long since just had woods and small trees. So we could get our wood in, get oak in from the Baltic, but really good of really big trees for mass was the United States. So that's why one of the big advantages we used to think of having that colony over in the other side of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm originally from Bemidji, Minnesota, which was a big logging
Right.
town there, and like in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there's a they'd chop the trees down there and float them down the river. There'd be the guys that go out there and they walk on the logs. In fact, there's still a tradition where they do these competitions of log rolling, where people will the one person will try to walk on the log, walking in one direction, the other
Mm.
person's walking the other direction on the other end of the log, and you try to spin the other guy off the thing, which is kind of based off of that. But anyway, so we're there, and actually, on the lake that I live on, there's a bunch of white pines, but
Yeah.
where I'm from is kind of we have the most famous statue of Paul Bunyan, Babe the Blue Ox, who was of course
Right.
a mythical log logger in the United States. So
Yeah.
woods
Well,
influenced our folklore.
he has, but it's amazing how little there is to remind people of your logging days. I went to around the Great Lakes when I was in Michigan. I went to a town called Muskegon, which was another logging town, also on the shores of Lake Michigan. And the amazing thing was there wasn't much remaining from that time of the town, because the problems was, well, I stayed in the bed and breakfast, which was lovely. It was a sort of massive, great house, which obviously belonged to a wealthy person. It had a ballroom on the top floor, lovely sprung wooden ballroom. It's fantastic. That was 1980. But the rest of Muskegon was mostly modern. And one of the problems that the Americans found was they built lots of houses cheaply with all this wood. The problem is that houses built of wood aren't that long lasting, especially if they're built with the lightweight sort of balloon framing in America. And so there were huge numbers of fires, and the wooden infrastructure of America was basically burned down at the end of the 19th century. So there's the Great Fire of Chicago in, I think, 1872, I think, and loads of other great fires. All these buildings, beautiful to look at, all made of lightweight construction, cheaply made of wood, and even had wooden roads, wooden sidewalks. And of course, all of that is, I'm afraid, incredibly impractical. So there's not much of Muskegon left. Not much. Chicago is a modern city. There aren't any old bits of, very few old bits of Chicago. Where I and I lived in Manchester, for instance, or Hull, where I live now, there's loads of old buildings because they're all burned and they didn't suffer from that fire. So we live in an old-fashioned sort of way, in old Victorian 19th century buildings, whereas most Americans live in modern houses which have been built since the Wood Age.